Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez. I'm the founder and CEO of Epic Project. This podcast is an ongoing conversation about how men can show up in the world in the best version of themselves. And I've said this from the beginning. I'll continue to say it. We don't become better men without really good women alongside of us. And today is opportunity for me to introduce you all to one such woman. She is accomplished. That's such a gross understatement, but this is my friend Irene Taylor. I'm going to just brag on. I'm going to read just a little bit of your bio, Irene, if I could, and then I want you to fill in the blanks. But Irene Taylor is an Oscar-nominated, multiple Emmy, DuPont, and Peabody Award-winning director and producer. Her most recent documentary, I Am, Celine Dion, premiered in June of 2024 at the Lincoln Center, entered a nationwide theatrical release, and soon became Amazon Prime's most popular documentary of all time worldwide. That's just your latest project, but this is my friend Irene. I'm so glad you're here, and I want to say thank you for taking time out of, I know it's a very busy schedule, but thanks for being here. Tell us a little bit about yourself beyond what I just described. You're a filmmaker.
Well, that is my profession. I am a filmmaker. And hi, Tom. Thank you for having me. I am a filmmaker by profession, but I really do think that the stories I try to tell, and, I don't always get to tell every story I want to tell, but the stories I try to tell, I try to make them sort of conveniently go hand in hand with my own life. In other words, I use stories as a way to reflect on my own transformation just as a human being. I'm a mother of 4 boys, and I am happily married to my second husband. And I am really always just trying to surround myself with stories and the people who are part of those stories, because I think they make me a better person. I'm here at Sundance Film Festival this week and in the great, beautiful state of Utah. And the Utah Film Commission the Utah Film Center, which is a nonprofit organization. It has a great motto, which is that good film makes good humans. And that really is my motto, because my films don't take a political stance. They really are more explanations or explorations of character-driven stories. So you just brought up my most recent project about Celine Dion. On its surface, it is a film about an iconic musician that most of us are aware of. But at the same time, it really, on a deeper level, is about evolving in our bodies as we go through life. And, in Celine's case, she was a powerhouse, a physical powerhouse, a performance powerhouse. And slowly this orphan illness was eating away at her body until finally she broke down and could not perform anymore. And so I think that many of us have had an experience that suddenly robs us of things we have just taken for granted for so long, And so Celine's story, even though it is very different from what I may be going through in my life, I'm always finding these touch points in my characters where I say, wow, that makes me think about my own experience, And so I think that's really what I would say about my profession and my personal life. But the truth is they're very intertwined.
Very intertwined, yeah. We first crossed paths. It's got to be close to 10 years ago now, maybe not quite that long. But it was in the context of you working on a project telling, or really helping survivors of trafficking tell their stories. It was called The Life Story. And that's where I first met you. And I honestly think you were probably the first person to, in ways that I don't like, there aren't like specific instances in conversation that we had, but I remember just watching you do your work and seeing the outcome of your work. And it was something that in a way lit the fire inside of me to start to recognize the value of storytelling. But you're just kind of give folks that are listening, the breadth of that work and telling the stories, it's broad. It's not like focused on one particular issue. You're not doing projects only on, say, human rights issues or something like that. Give us a smattering of all the different projects that you've
Sure.
that you've done.
Yeah, well, I guess I've always been interested in portraiture. So my films are what I would call character driven. So the one I just did on Celine is sort of the apex of character driven in that it is a singular portrait of one person. Um, and she is the only person in the film who is voicing her own story. Of course, it is also my story because out of the many, many hours of footage that we had, I narrowed it down to 90 minutes, right? So the story becomes the edited version of what the character gives to me.
Right.
Now, but I have made feature-length films about my family. That's actually kind of how I got started.
Mm.
My first theatrically released film, other than television documentaries that I had done back in the late 90s and early 2000s, I made about my mother and my father, who are two deaf people born in the 90s, profoundly deaf. And I essentially told their love story. And that film actually premiered at Sundance in 2007 and won the Audience Award, which really gave me tremendous opportunity in the future. But I illustrate this to tell you that I remember when I was making the film, I would say, yeah, I'm making a movie about my mom and my dad. And generally the response from people would be like, oh, that's so sweet. Is that your first film? And I'm like, oh, no, I've actually been making films. I just have never had one that's this long, I've never quite made one this long. And then when it won Sundance, it was like, wow, that suddenly it didn't seem like a childish endeavor anymore, And so then people started to take me seriously. And so since then, I've made a film about grief camp for children that's nationwide, that is for children who have lost a parent. And they come to this summer camp to be around other kids who have been through an extraordinarily similar tragic event in their lives. I've made a film about two 12-year-old girls who became so convinced that an internet boogeyman was existing in their true world and not just a figment of their virtual imagination, called Slenderman. I made a very devastating film about their attempt to kill their best friend when they were 12 years old. And that has been an ongoing story since I made the film. It was very well received by even the family of the girls who I made it about, because it really, in a way, was a challenging film about how hard it is to be a parent in the internet age. There are so many things on the internet that once you see them, you can't unsee them. And once they get under your skin, you can't shake them, and these girls were creative, imaginative, straight A students. And somehow they just kind of drank the virtual Kool-Aid, and they were doing things that they never would have been expected to do. I made another film about my father, who is deaf, about Ludwig van Beethoven, who is also deaf, and my son, Jonas. So 3 deaf men over 300 years. And that was called Moonlight Sonata, which also came here to Sundance. And that really was my way of sort of braiding together my family history with music and really looking at how deafness in my family was, although it was a hurdle to get over for a lot of us, and certainly for my parents and for my deaf son, Jonas, and my deaf father, Paul, it really became our superpower over time. And I think that is the sort of premise of that story was about Beethoven writing his famous sonata called the Moonlight Sonata. And if you can't hear it in your mind right now, I promise most of your listeners, if they hear it, they'll be like, oh, that's the one. That's the one, right?
Yeah.
And he wrote that as he was going deaf. And so the film really becomes this way to understand disability or difference. And while we may think in the beginning that it singles us out or it makes life more troublesome or it's a hurdle to get over, ultimately, if you can make art out of it, you can actually make your singular perspective that no one else has, and it becomes a power that you have that no one else will ever have. And so anyway, there are more. Recently, I did also, maybe relevant to your listeners, I made a film several years ago that's still on Hulu called Leave No Trace, A Hidden History of the Boy Scouts. And that film follows 4 young men and men from the ages of 16 up to early 70s, all of whom were sexually abused during their time as Boy Scouts. And so that was also a very powerful film to make, which did not come out of personal experience for me, but it did come out of a deep concern I had for something that was happening in Oregon at the time, which is that we had a landmark case here in Oregon some 15 years ago that ultimately would bring the Boy Scouts as an organization down. And that was when our Supreme Court required the Boy Scouts of America to release their lists. They were called perversion files. And they released a list of 100 years of people within their ranks, within the Boy Scout organization, dating all the way back to the 90s, who were violating the rights of young boys. And the Oregon Supreme Court required those records just from like a 20 or 30-year period to be released. But that was enough to really turn the tide of public opinion against the Boy Scouts, because it became very clear that in spite of all of the amazing work that the Boy Scouts have done with my own boys, my boys were all Boy Scouts, that for many decades, they have been covering up what I would call an epidemic of dysfunctional behavior. So, some of my films are kind of lightning rods and some of them are just more poetic explanations.
Hey, Masculine Wilderness podcast listeners, this is Lauren, your producer. If you found value in our show, we've got an epic opportunity for you. Become an epic ally today and join our fight against human trafficking. Your monthly support not only keeps this podcast going, but also fuels our mission to protect the vulnerable and combat exploitation. For less than 1 coffee a week, you can make a real difference. Head on over to epicproject.org and choose an amount that works for you. Even $13 a month can change lives. By becoming an Epic ally, you're not just supporting the podcast, you're joining a movement. Stand with us. Let's make an impact together. Thank you.
So this whole idea of story, this is how it's affected me, and really I think in a lot of ways how it's affected the work we do at Epic. For those that are listening that might not know, one of the things that Epic is known for over the years is we've figured out a way on a large scale using technology, kind of everyday technology, to directly engage active online sex buyers. And you've witnessed that, Irene, and we've been doing this for a long time. But when we started, our approach it just felt intuitive as a man, because it was my idea to try this years ago. Wasn't what it is now is not my idea. It's a whole bunch of really smart people that have built on the idea. But the idea was simply to intercept active online sex buyers. And when we showed up originally, it's like we kind of came in the door, so to speak, with a baseball bat, and we wanted to expose these guys for the harm they were doing. We wanted to, I think in a lot of ways, if I look back on it now, I wouldn't have admitted it at the time, but we wanted to shame them. We wanted to shame them into stopping. And what we were seeing early on when we were engaging these guys is shame had very little effect on their willingness to even talk about the situation. What changed was I had this new friend, Irene, who's talking about telling stories. And so we started simply, this is a bit of a generalization, but it does capture the shift in how we approach buyers. We started by saying things like, when we would talk to these buyers, what's your story? And just that invitation to tell your story led to a whole bunch of open doors and a whole bunch of a deeper level of conversation. My question for you is, in the work that you do, why is there so much power in that kind of an invitation and, into people telling their stories? What is it that makes that it can be so profound for the person listening, but maybe more so for the person that's telling their story? Why is it so powerful?
Well, I think in some ways it's an invitation for someone to share how they identify themselves. So I think, my experience as a parent, when you catch your son, I have 4 sons, and, if I catch my son with his, hand in the cookie jar, proverbially or realistically, right?
Yeah.
Hey, what's your story? I'm innocent. It wasn't me. Now, this is him saying, of course he's not innocent because his hand is literally in the cookie jar, right? But what he's saying is, I'm really a good kid, Mom. I'm innocent. I'm just hungry. And dinner's kind of late. You know what I mean? So there's a way I think that you can approach people even if, they feel like, well, first of all, I don't typically interview or make films about people who are completely on the defensive, but sometimes I do. Yeah. And I think that when you ask someone, what's your story? I don't know that I actually use that phrase, but it's a really interesting question because I think what it does is it's an invitation for someone to tell you something about themselves. And I have a fraction of the percentage of experience you and your team do in talking with sex buyers, but I have overheard a number of your conversations. And I think if I had to guess, many of these men have just never had anyone ask them, like, hey, who are you? And not with the baseball bat anymore, because you learned a thing or two, sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah.
But really just more, what's going on? How is it that you came to call me? Well, I came to call you because I got your phone number from an ad. Yeah, well, why did you want to respond to the ad? What's going on with that? And you just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think, some of the best questions really are open-ended questions. And a dear friend of mine was a screenwriter. His name was Gil Dennis. And one of his many titles to his name is he wrote the Johnny Cash script, Walk the Line.
Oh, wow.
And he said, Irene, I only had 1 hour that I could talk with Johnny Cash before I had to write that. And so his manager told me it was going to be very limited time. So I decided to ask him 3 questions. And I asked him, what are you the most ashamed of? What are you the most afraid of? And what is it that you want most? And those 3 questions formed the basis of that entire film, which was brilliant, played by Joaquin Phoenix, and really just was, I think also Johnny Cash and, Johnny Cash's family, I should say, they really thought that the screenplay nailed it. So I think sometimes asking open-ended questions of people is you can learn the most.
So say those 3 again. That's really meaty. What are you
the most afraid of?
What are you most ashamed of?
What are you the most ashamed of? And what do you want the most?
It's so. This is the first time you've never shared this story with me, and it's amazing how much those 3 questions are in many ways the kinds of questions we've learned as we've interacted with these guys. That those kinds of questions, open-ended, thoughtful questions, like they're very much in line with that. That's really astute. Wow.
Now I'll also add my attorney, my entertainment attorney who helps me negotiate my contracts for my films, has taught me over the years, don't say too much. Don't say too much. When you're negotiating something, and I thought, I've sort of learned that over the years in that, her point to me was just be quiet sometimes and see what comes back at you when you are negotiating something, right?
Right.
See what comes back at you, because it's really remarkable what you are saying, not only about yourself, but about your biases. When you're trying to have, in a sense, you are negotiating dialogue with these men. If you can keep them on the phone.
Yeah.
It really becomes, it's like a hostage crisis, right? You're just whatever you do, just keep them on the phone, keep them on the phone, right? And so I think finding those moments where you do reveal yourself, they need to be crystallized wisdom, and not saying too much, because then after a while, you might just, because I have to think these men, they're a little afraid. So they stay on the phone in the beginning because they feel like they're, quote, in trouble. Their hand was caught in the cookie jar, and they're just trying to say, hey, I'm actually a good guy. So let me tell you something about myself. But if you tell them too much about yourself, they're going to tell you what you want to hear. But if you don't tell them too much about yourself, you are maybe going to be able to help them.
And that's a skill you have to learn by trial and error, because the subjects of your work have been men and women, boys, girls. Is this a gender thing? Like the responsiveness to the invitation to tell a story? Are women more inclined? Are men more inclined? Or do you not see a difference?
Oh, I don't see a difference. I think I will compliment your team in that I think men really do have a place playing the role that your team makes, or that your team has. The role that you play, there's something very valuable about men talking to men that I feel like I just wouldn't be as good at. So I think it really depends. I mean, I think I look at my kids and I look at their generation, and I think so many things about our North American culture. We're moving towards less binary definitions of men and women. And of course, those carry themselves to very extreme practical ends, right? But they also I think there's a certain fluidity in that sort of, I can tap into my masculinity and you can tap into your femininity. And, we can sit here and argue till the end of the earth about whether, openness is a female quality or if it's a male quality. But I think in a way, it doesn't really matter. But I think it's a matter of fact that there are always going to be men who would rather talk to another man. And there's always going to be women who talk to another woman.
Yeah.
Woman.
Yeah. And I mean, that's certainly true when you're talking to, someone who's trying to buy sex at the moment. You're trying to buy sex. It's definitely the case. And I've heard this so many times especially from survivors, that a survivor could say something to a room of men about their experience, about why, they shouldn't be reduced to a thing that could be bought, whatever. They could say that. I could then stand and it would fall on deaf ears. But if I stand up and say the same thing to the same group of men, they get it. And the only thing I can conclude after doing this for a long time is there's just, I don't know if it's there's a certain frequency of a man's voice when he's speaking to another man, and maybe it's just the shared experience. I get where you're coming from. And so you're right. And that's why, for me, that's why I say this is largely men's work to do. But go back to, some of maybe the artificial distinctions we make between what is feminine, what is masculine. Vulnerability. Any well-told story exposes vulnerabilities within the characters' lives and the stories they're telling. How do you, because I've seen you do this in the Life Story Project. It was the clearest example to me, but you were there face to face with these women as they were telling some horrific stories. And extreme vulnerability. How do you do that? How does a person draw out that kind of vulnerability from another person? And there's a purpose to it. Obviously, we don't do it carelessly, but how do you do that? Or how did you learn to do that?
Well, my immediate answer to that would be giving them your undivided attention. And I think it's the human brain. We're in our brain, even though I'm looking at you right now, Tom, I still might be thinking different thoughts but engaging with them in eye contact, because I'm in the world of the cinematic field, right? So I'm looking at these people and they're looking at me, whether I'm walking down a road with them, filming them while we walk, or whether I'm interviewing them while they fix under the hood of their car, or I have them seated. And with these women, they were seated looking at me directly in the face. But where does it come from? I think for me personally, it would be obvious to me that some of that comes from growing up with deaf parents. If my parents could not see my face, they could not effectively hear me. And so I learned by the time I could babble that they didn't even know I was babbling unless they could see my face. Maybe if they had their hand on my body, they could feel the vibration. Yeah. But generally speaking, as I was getting older, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10, 15, I really had to look at them. And if I looked at them with my eyes as well, it intonated my language. It gave expression to it because they can't hear emphasis, right? So I would use my eyes to emphasize something. And I don't mean because I was crying or afraid, or just say, can you believe that, Mom? With a, in your face. And then by the time I was a teenager, realized if I looked away, they couldn't hear me. And I still feel bad. The time I got so mad at my dad, and I was probably a freshman or sophomore in high school. I got so mad at my dad, and I walked away from him, and I yelled an expletive at him.
Knowing he couldn't hear you.
And knowing he couldn't hear me, but I said it so loud, Tom, he like felt the vibration in the air or something. It spooked me out because he said, "What did you say?" He knew I said something,
yeah,
but he didn't know what I said. So, and I'm still feeling guilty about it. So, I think that attention, just giving someone your attention, we are so distracted. And I don't know, I feel like the distractions just keep growing and growing in our world. And so I think that just giving someone your attention is like a really important first step.
That's feels so intuitive, and like surely it can't be that easy, but I think you're right. I think we talk about this, one of the things that's hard for men is to simply show up and to be present. Mm-hmm. And to pay attention. We've had other guests on that have talked similarly about how, just the presence, your presence is its own kind of superpower if you manage it well. And I think for men, sometimes a reason that's hard is because we think I have to show up and talk as a man. Mm-hmm. Whereas sometimes you just need to show up and like what you're saying is listen and just pay attention. Mm-hmm. And the most powerful thing I think for men sometimes, and the most difficult, is to shut up and listen.
Women are guilty of that too.
This I know. Having been married for a long time and having raised 3 daughters. Yes, that's not.
I forgot about that fun little difference between us.
Yes,
you only know daughters. I only know sons.
I was so. I mean, I love my daughters. I know you love your sons, but when my middle daughter had a son, and all of a sudden I've got a grandson in my life, it was like a whole new world opened up. Cue the music. It was so awesome. But anyway, don't get me talking about my grandkids just yet. Kind of back to vulnerabilities. Another question I have about that is when the kind of the table is set, so to speak, and the invitation is extended for someone to be vulnerable, to share something, why is it that so often becomes such an endearing thing? And part of the reason I'm asking is just watching your work on Celine Dion. There was something, as much of a superstar as she is, there was something so humanizing about just seeing a woman who's struggling with the severe health issue. Why does vulnerability why does it make someone so endearing? Like, what is it about that?
Well, I think it's relatable. Yeah. We all are scared we're all scared, aren't we?
Yes. Yes, we are.
Scared. We're all scared. Our best friend, our spouse is going to die. We're all afraid our child is going to not like us anymore when they grow up. We're all afraid. We have these fleeting moments, and they may be totally irrational. I could be the best mother in the world, and I still, some days we're like, I hope my kid still likes me when he's 25. He wants to come home, and but I think any of us, more to your point and more poignantly, any of us who have ever endured suffering, mental suffering, physical suffering especially, is we are roped in to someone else's experience, particularly when we think they're perfect and we see, wow, she doesn't always have a great day every day. In fact, she hasn't had a good day in a year. Wow. For 17 years, Celine Dion was addicted to Valium. He was addicted to Valium. For her to be able to tell that to me, knowing that this would go out to the world. Yeah. And she was not addicted to Valium because she wanted to feel good. She was addicted to Valium so she could function. Because for her, Valium had a neuromuscular effect on her, which prevented her body from going into spasm. Wow. So, and then of course she created there was a psychological component to it over time because it would also sort of put her mind at ease. And so it became harder and harder to tolerate stress, So I think that in the case of, Celine, but I think, I think there are other examples in my films, and one of the more heartbreaking ones that I can think of right now is, that every single one of the men who were part of my film Leave No Trace, every single one of these men living with their experience of abuse still felt somewhere like they invited it.
Even when they were telling you the story.
Yes, even though they have gone through, some of them have been through therapy, some of them have, had supportive spouses, family members, friends, medical professionals who try to convince them otherwise. There's still this feeling like, yes, but I did something wrong. And so I think that's another thing that makes us feel vulnerable, is that we feel like we've somehow messed up. And so I do think that, I hate to say that storytelling is about pulling vulnerabilities out of people, because if that was my motto, no one would ever want to be my subject, because, they would think, oh man, she's going to rake me over the coals with a gentle, tender smile on her face, but she's still going to make it hard, And so, but my feeling is, when you come out of those conversations, the awareness that comes with that can really be, for both of us, both the interviewer and the interviewee, can really be quite profound. And one of the things I am most grateful for, and at the same time so regretful that I can't tell my film subjects this on a more regular basis, is that they changed their life as much as I may have changed theirs with the making of the film.
Yeah.
And so they changed my life too. And I learned things from them. And in some ways, sometimes they make me want to experience things. And so I am inspired to go out of my life and do something better or do something different. But they also help me understand that trauma that comes with an experience that I will never have to experience myself. Right. So
that makes me think of something that I think is connected to this. I've had the privilege of seeing some of the process that you go through in your art, and it's very intimate and it is very personal. So you sit really, really closely to all kinds of trauma. What have you learned in the process of that about just managing that experience so that the vicarious trauma doesn't overwhelm you? What has that taught you about how to manage that, how to navigate that?
Well,
I don't imagine you go home at the end of a day, of a session, where you're filming, and you don't think about what you just heard. You don't think about the story and the implications.
Sure.
So how do you navigate that?
I carry it with me. Well, and remember, it's easy to forget things that people tell me, but when you're making a film, you edit the same thing over and over and over again. It's going to go in the film. And it really has a way of just embedding itself in your skin cells. It's it's there. So I think I try to implement some of the things that I observe into being a more empathic person, or trying to understand the other side of the aisle. If it's maybe a political thought that I may not personally agree with, or a way of approaching life, or the choice, for instance, to buy sex. I personally was drawn to your project for so many reasons, but meaning the Epic project, your ongoing work with that, for so many reasons. But one is because I am all for human intimacy, but I am not for intimacy that's so lopsided, And so I was really interested to see how men could help other men maybe just balance the ballast of the boat a little better, that we're all in the same boat, But and I'm not sitting here crying out that, women always get the shorter end of the stick. I see increasing examples around the world and in my own life where women really are empowered and more empowered than they've ever been, and I think that's a great thing, for all of us. I think it makes better people, but I think that, I think sometimes I do have to get some physical exercise. So I'll like go for a swim or go for a walk. That helps. But generally speaking, I always assume that anyone who is relaying something that may have been traumatic for them or physical pain, like in the case of Celine, there's a very intense scene in the movie where you just see her in excruciating physical pain. And I will never understand that experience. I might break my arm. I might have another kind of experience, but the point is you can, just the process of trying to understand it or trying to emulate that feeling, I think is a good exercise.
Yeah. Yeah. You go home and you say, go exercise or go for a walk. Are there other things you do that are kind of, not, I would say to any other person, say a creative outlet, but so much of what you do is just innately creative. But like, what for you is life-giving outside of the scope of the work you do day to day?
Well, one other thing I do, I guess, is I talk about these things with other people. I don't say, my friend Tom Perez confided in me and he said this and this and that. I don't mean that. But I'll say, I was talking to someone the other day and I had this experience and I say something, I'll got it, or I'll just say, I've been thinking about something this last week. But the reason I'm thinking about it, of course, is because someone told me in confidence and it just got me to thinking. Or if it's a very public thing, I'll just say, hey, I was talking to Tom Perez on a podcast and he asked me this question and here's what I answered. And you can go hear it for yourself, Yeah. But so I do find that talking, I think there are storytellers out there in my field of documentary filmmaking who they like to absorb, and then their way of kind of processing it and putting back out a product is to create the film, and then the film speaks for their expression. It speaks for their opinion, right? Or observation on something. Whereas I'm not always, I think in the case of the Boy Scouts film, for example, it's pretty clear cut. Yeah. You said it earlier, well, to say the least, that was dysfunctional. Yeah. Yeah. There's not much like moral equivocation.
It's not super nuanced.
Yeah, it's not very nuanced. But I think, so that film was not very oblique. But I do often try to be oblique because in that obliqueness, I give my audience the room to form their own impressions and reflect on their own biases and their own experiences. So when I'm touching something that might be construed as political, or I'm touching upon something, 12-year-old girls doing things that are really not typical of 12-year-old girls, I'm not saying, these parents, what were they thinking? How did they let them watch the internet? That's terrible. Like, no, but there are going to be people who watch that movie and they say, well, you leave your child attended. They're going to watch this, they're going to watch that, But there are also other people like me who just say, not only can I not police my child 24/7, I also eventually need them to make good decisions for themselves. And so I got to let them make some mistakes. But isn't it tragic when mistakes are sometimes not reversible? Yeah. And in the case of these girls, they paid a dear price and they were incarcerated for a long time, So, yeah, I think through my subjects, I do really process a lot of things by proxy.
Yeah.
And I don't have to go through them myself, but I can observe them. And I hope it makes me a better friend. I hope it makes me a better mom, better partner,
Yeah, I've seen you contain the emotional weight of so many of these stories and do it, in what appears to be a super healthy way. Did you imagine that at this point in your life you would be doing what you're doing? Like, did you always want to be a filmmaker, or was this something that found you by accident, so to speak?
I always wanted to be a photographer. And I think I always wanted to be a photographer. And as I talked a little bit earlier about being young with deaf parents, I also knew that communication, you had to be careful. You couldn't just like walk away from your mom and tell her something. Even if it was as banal as, I'll be home at 6 p.m. You can't say it as you're walking out the door. You got to look at her in the face. You got to say, I'll be home at 6 p.m. So I think intentional communication is something that I came up with. I think the filmmaking, the storytelling aspect came out of going into photography, both I was a kid who just grew up in the dark room with my parents. My parents were very, very, very engaged photographers, printed their own pictures in the 1970s and 80s. I did black and white color pictures, all of that. And I really loved it. And then as my education continued, I realized that I really liked layering pictures with written explanations. I used to love National Geographic, right? As a young kid.
Yeah, me too.
And I wouldn't read the articles.
Nope.
I would look at the picture and I would read the very informative caption.
That we were reading the same way.
Yep. Yeah. And then if I really was engaged, I'd go back and read the article, right? And I think that at some point when I got into the field of journalism, because I studied journalism in college, then I realized, wow, I really love the visual layer with the audible layer. And the audible layer can come out of, writing a script and then you're just reading it or, whatever it was. So then I realized I really loved the relationship between what you see and what you hear and how that creates a summative tone that makes you have an emotional response. And I really think some of the best films, and I know, back to gender stereotypes, women are so emotional. I would argue that is what life is about. And there's an amazing music artist out there named Brian Eno, and there's a film out there right now called Eno that has just come out this year. It's fascinating. But he does ask the question, he says, he doesn't strike you as the most emotional man. And yet he said, there's a kind of I'm going to get this wrong, but I'm going to try to approximate what he said, which is that, people sort of look down their nose at emotional things, that we think the intellect is like a higher functioning, a way of functioning, our intellect. But what if life is only emotions? And then we're just using our intellect to understand our emotions.
The emotions.
It all starts with the emotion. And I think that was quite profound because I think that maybe if there are differences in people, it's not that we're not feeling emotions. It's not that we're not vulnerable. It's we have a different way of kind of camouflaging them or making sense of them. Yeah. And some of us try to psychoanalyze, and some of us try to say, I'm just going to get together with my girlfriends tonight because I really need some support. Yeah. Or in the case of these men, same thing.
I would argue with men. I think I've heard a lot of people criticize men in general, kind of the masculine culture, and say, well, they're not very good at, feeling. They don't feel anything. And my response is like, we feel everything. Mm-hmm. We just so often lack the language, the words to express and to process the things we feel. But men are as feeling as women. It's just, I think so often, we're not taught how to engage those feelings for sure. I think that's why I think that's one of the things that draws men into some really dark, unhealthy expressions of masculinity. As part of it is it's just those unresolved, if you will, I guess, feelings, but we feel them all. So I want to give you the last word is as our custom. And I want to create a scene for you I'm going to dare to do this with my friend who's an accomplished filmmaker, but here it is. Okay. Your sons, all four of them, are now young adults. They're seated around your kitchen table or sitting on your counter in your kitchen. And they're all, maybe because there's an age difference there, let's say the last one is about ready to kind of go off on his own. I don't even know if you can see that far ahead, but let's imagine that. As a mom, as a storyteller, just as a fellow human being, what is it that you desire most for the world that they will inhabit as young men?
Well, I hope they will find people who love them as much as I do. And I hope that they will have the confidence that somehow I got. Some days I feel so weak, and other days I'm like, where does this rocket fuel I have come from? And I think a lot of it goes back to love and care. But I have met so many people, both in my personal life and people whom I have interviewed, who have overcome loveless childhoods. And the love they have to give is staggeringly beautiful. So I hope that my sons don't have to meet their mother. I don't mean that. But to meet people who like really love them for who they are and want them to grow and explore the world and, you know, and not be too threatened by that, you know? So, I think, that's what I would say. And who they love and who loves them back. I don't mind what gender they are. I don't mind, where they live, what kind of clothes they wear, what social class they are. You know, I want them to be surrounded by, I want them to choose people. They're always going to work with people they don't like. They're always going to have to endure things they don't want. And I'm constantly reminding him that, hey, that's life. That's a work. Yeah, that's your boss. There's not a good connection there, but maybe the next one will be better. More to the point these days, that's the teacher you got this year.
That's good.
You're not gelling with that teacher.
Yeah.
Next year, you might get a new teacher and you might feel differently about this topic. You know what I mean? So, yeah. So I think kind of all goes back to
the love.
To love. Yeah.
Yeah.
Goes back
to... That sounds so unsophisticated and so true.
It's very simple.
It is.
I'm not saying love is a prerequisite for success in life. I have had the profound luxury of having people tell me so many very private things about themselves. And I think what is remarkable is how far they have come. And that's really the yardstick, I think, of life, is not like how far do we get, but how far have we come from where we started, you know? And so anyone who's, I think, had a second marriage maybe can understand that too. Mm-hmm. It's just, you know, sometimes we do need to start over. And whether that's with a relationship or maybe it's a career or, you know, and so I hope, you know, my boys will always have those kind of yardsticks that help them be willing to quit something that's not working, or to start over, or to keep at it, or to embrace the rocket fuel, you know, so.
And they have a mother that loves them. That is no small thing. Irene Taylor, you're a blessing to me, to Epic, and we're grateful for your friendship. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, so much. And thanks for the work you guys do. It really is. It really is. I think magic is probably not a word a lot of people would think to associate with what you do, but I think magical things happen when people surprise you, you know, and you surprise the people that you talk to on the phone when you reveal who you are, but then I'm sure they surprise you too.
Yeah. And I think at the root of it is love. I think it's a desire to express love to people who we might feel don't deserve it. So,
That's right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, Tom.
Enjoy Sundance.
Okay.
Bye.